In September 1939, as German armored columns crossed into Poland, the world's attention fixed on the visible front lines. Armies moved, borders collapsed, capitals braced for siege. What mattered, according to prevailing military thought, was mass, divisions, tonnage, firepower, and the capacity to seize and hold terrain. Victory was understood as something achieved through contact, through battles that could be mapped, measured, and publicly acknowledged. Behind that assumption sat a deeper institutional belief shared by nearly every major power of the Second World War. Wars were decided where armies collided. Intelligence, espionage, covert action, and economic warfare were auxiliary functions, important but subordinate. They were enablers of battle, not decisive arenas in their own right. This belief was not naive. It was grounded in experience. The First World War had been decided by industrial attrition, coalition endurance, and battlefield exhaustion. Intelligence failures had mattered, but only insofar as they affected troop movements or tactical surprise. Strategic outcomes still flowed from mass mobilization and visible engagements. Interwar military institutions therefore optimized for what they understood best: command hierarchies designed for maneuver warfare, logistic systems built to sustain divisions, and doctrines that assumed clarity of frontlines and identifiable enemies. Even intelligence services were shaped by this assumption. Their role was to support commanders by reducing uncertainty before battle, estimating enemy strength, identifying objectives, and forecasting movements. Covert activity was expected to shorten campaigns, not replace them. Intelligence failures were dangerous. Intelligence successes were helpful. Neither was considered decisive on its own. As a result, the most critical struggles of the war were expected to be loud. They would involve artillery, armor, air power, and naval engagements that could be seen, recorded, and commemorated. Quiet fronts, if they existed at all, were expected to follow the main effort, not shape it. This assumption structured planning at every level. National leaders allocated resources accordingly. Industrial output prioritized weapons platforms over cryptography, signals interception, or counterintelligence infrastructure. Training pipelines favored combat arms over analysts, linguists, or case officers. Even when investments were made in intelligence capabilities, they were often fragmented, under-resourced, and institutionally marginalized. Yet from the opening months of the war, reality began to diverge from expectation. The German victory in Poland was not merely the product of armored thrusts. It depended on radio interception, deception, and the systematic disruption of Polish command and control. In Scandinavia, the success of German operations hinged as much on intelligence penetration and political subversion as on naval landings. In France, Allied defeat was accelerated not only by operational surprise, but by failures in information flow, misinterpreted signals, delayed assessments, and an intelligence system unable to adapt once assumptions were violated. Still, these outcomes were interpreted through the existing lens. Intelligence was credited with enabling battlefield success, not redefining it. The assumption survived because it appeared to explain events sufficiently. By 1941, however, the scale of the war forced institutions to confront a contradiction. The conflict had become global. Supply chains stretched across oceans. Coalitions relied on coordination between governments that did not fully trust one another. Decisions made in distant capitals produced effects months later, thousands of miles away. Under these conditions, information itself became a form of power, one that did not require massed formations or open combat to be effective. Nowhere was this more evident than in the expanding war at sea. Naval warfare exposed the limitations of the traditional assumption faster than any other domain. Submarines operated invisibly. Convoys moved across vast, empty spaces. Engagements were often decided before either side realized contact had occurred. Success depended less on firepower at the moment of engagement and more on detection, prediction, and coordination across time and distance. The Battle of the Atlantic, which began in 1939 and continued until 1945, was not a single battle at all. It was a prolonged contest over information. Who knew where ships were, who could conceal movements, and who could process intelligence quickly enough to act on it. Yet for years, Allied planning treated it as a problem of shipbuilding and escort numbers. Intelligence failures were acknowledged, but not understood as systemic. A similar dynamic emerged in the air war. Strategic bombing campaigns relied on navigation systems, weather forecasting, signals intelligence, and deception operations that shaped outcomes long before bombs were dropped. Radar, electronic warfare, and code-breaking quietly determined when and where battles occurred. But again, these were framed as supporting technologies, not frontlines. On land, resistance movements and partisan warfare complicated occupation strategies. Intelligence networks formed among civilian populations. Information flowed through churches, rail yards, postal systems, and black markets. Occupying powers found themselves fighting enemies who rarely appeared in uniform, and whose most dangerous weapon was not a rifle, but timely information passed to the right recipient. Still, military institutions resisted reclassification. These activities were described as irregular, auxiliary, or unconventional, terms that preserved the conceptual primacy of conventional battle. The reason for this resistance was structural. Frontline warfare was legible. It could be commanded through established hierarchies. Success could be measured in territory gained or enemy units destroyed. Intelligence-driven fronts, by contrast, produced ambiguous outcomes. Victories were often invisible. Failures were difficult to attribute. Effects unfolded over months rather than days. For organizations built around clear chains of command and immediate feedback, this created discomfort. As a result, many of the war's most consequential contests unfolded in administrative offices, signals rooms, and back-channel negotiations, rather than on maps marked with arrows. Decisions about cipher systems, counterintelligence priorities, and information-sharing agreements quietly shaped operational possibilities without ever being acknowledged as decisive acts. By 1942, this quiet struggle had expanded dramatically. The Allied powers had begun to integrate intelligence at an unprecedented scale. Signals interception centers processed thousands of messages daily. Cryptographic breakthroughs provided insight into enemy intentions with a precision previously unimaginable. Deception operations were coordinated across theaters, using false information to shape enemy deployments months in advance. At the same time, Axis powers faced growing vulnerabilities. Their reliance on radio communication created exploitable patterns. Institutional rivalries fragmented intelligence analysis. Political interference distorted assessments. Yet these weaknesses were not immediately visible on any battlefield. What appeared from the outside to be a series of conventional victories and defeats was increasingly determined by unseen contests over knowledge, interpretation, and secrecy. Armies advanced or stalled because of decisions made in rooms far from the front. Naval engagements occurred or failed to occur because of information withheld or misread. Entire campaigns unfolded along paths shaped by intelligence that one side possessed and the other did not even know existed. Despite this, official narratives remained focused on the loudest battles. Victory was still described in terms of landings, offensives, and breakthroughs. The silent frontlines remained conceptually subordinate, even as their influence expanded. By 1943, the contradiction was no longer sustainable. The outcome of major operations increasingly depended on conditions created by intelligence dominance rather than battlefield improvisation. Commanders acted with confidence or hesitation based on information asymmetries invisible to their adversaries. Strategic momentum shifted without corresponding clashes. The foundational assumption that wars were decided primarily by visible combat had not merely weakened, it had become false. By the middle years of the Second World War, the loudest battles were no longer always the most decisive. The front lines that mattered most were often silent, dispersed, and unrecognized, shaping outcomes long before guns were fired. By 1943, this assumption stopped being true. Once the assumption that wars were decided primarily by visible combat had taken hold, military institutions built systems to reinforce it. These systems did not merely reflect doctrine, they actively constrained how information was collected, interpreted, and acted upon. Intelligence-driven fronts existed, but they were embedded inside structures designed for conventional warfare, and therefore shaped by its priorities. At the strategic level, intelligence organizations were fragmented by design. Most belligerent powers entered the war with multiple, overlapping agencies responsible for collection and analysis. Military intelligence focused on enemy order of battle and operational intentions. Naval intelligence tracked fleets and shipping. Air intelligence estimated aircraft production and basing. Civilian services handled espionage, counterintelligence, and political reporting. Coordination between these bodies was limited, often informal, and frequently adversarial. This fragmentation mattered because intelligence value depended on synthesis. Raw information, intercepted messages, agent reports, aerial photographs, was rarely decisive on its own. Its power came from correlation, matching signals with movement, confirming reports against logistics data, identifying patterns across time. Institutional separation made such synthesis difficult. Each organization optimized for its own mandate rather than for system-wide understanding. Command structures reinforced this separation. Intelligence flowed upward through bureaucratic channels before moving laterally or downward. Field commanders often received assessments stripped of uncertainty, caveats, or alternative interpretations because institutional culture rewarded decisiveness over nuance. Analysts were expected to support operational plans, not challenge their premises. Technology further shaped the system's behavior. Radio communication allowed unprecedented coordination across distances, but it also created dependence. Orders, reports, and logistical requests increasingly moved through wireless channels. This accelerated decision-making, but it also generated an expanding electromagnetic signature that adversaries could exploit. The system assumed security through encryption, not through minimizing exposure. Cryptography therefore became a central pillar. Codes and ciphers were treated as technical safeguards rather than operational vulnerabilities. Responsibility for their integrity often rested with specialists isolated from planners and commanders. As long as encryption was believed secure, the system assumed that transmitted information remained private. Few institutions planned for the possibility of sustained, systematic code compromise. Information flow within this system followed predictable patterns. Collection units gathered data. Analysts processed it. Reports were produced on fixed schedules. Decision-makers consumed summaries rather than raw inputs. Feedback loops were slow. If an assessment proved incorrect, the correction might take weeks to propagate, if it propagated at all. These characteristics were not accidental. They reflected the scale of the war and the limitations of human processing. Millions of personnel generated torrents of information. Without rigid structures, the system would collapse under its own weight. Standardization, hierarchy, and compartmentalization were necessary to function at all. However, these same features created hidden vulnerabilities. One vulnerability was time lag. Intelligence-driven effects often depended on speed, detecting a pattern early enough to act before the enemy adapted. Bureaucratic processing delayed response. By the time information reached the level where decisions could be made, its relevance was often degraded. Another vulnerability was confirmation bias. Analysts worked within doctrinal frameworks that defined what constituted plausible enemy behavior. Information that fit expectations was weighted more heavily than information that challenged them. Because quiet fronts rarely produced immediate, observable results, their indicators were often dismissed as noise. A third vulnerability was asymmetry. Intelligence success was inherently invisible to the adversary. If one side penetrated the other's communications, the victim had no immediate signal that compromise had occurred. The system therefore lacked natural corrective feedback. Failures produced obvious consequences, successes did not. This asymmetry encouraged risk accumulation. Once a code was believed secure, it tended to remain in use. Once an intelligence channel appeared reliable, it gained authority. Over time, entire operational plans came to rest on assumptions that were never revalidated under adversarial conditions. Despite these weaknesses, the system appeared to work, at least superficially. Early Axis successes reinforced confidence in centralized planning supported by intelligence estimates. Early Allied failures were attributed to material shortages or poor coordination rather than information deficits. As industrial mobilization increased, attention shifted toward production metrics. Ships launched, aircraft built, divisions fielded. Intelligence capacity grew, but it remained framed as a supporting function. Gradually, however, the volume and complexity of information exceeded what existing structures could manage. Signals interception expanded exponentially. New technologies, radar, high-frequency direction finding, long-range reconnaissance, produced streams of data that did not fit neatly into established reporting formats. Intelligence agencies improvised solutions, often creating parallel processes outside formal command channels. This improvisation marked the beginning of an informal, quiet frontline. Specialized centers emerged to process signals intelligence continuously rather than episodically. Analysts began working directly with operational planners, bypassing layers of hierarchy. Liaison officers embedded intelligence functions inside commands, blurring institutional boundaries. These adaptations were pragmatic responses to operational pressure, not the result of doctrinal reform. Crucially, these changes occurred unevenly. Some organizations embraced integration, others resisted it. Political culture, leadership personalities, and inter-service rivalries shaped outcomes as much as technical capability. Where integration succeeded, intelligence effects compounded rapidly. Where it failed, information remained trapped in silos. The system was now under strain from two directions. On one side, the scale of the war demanded faster, more accurate information processing. On the other, institutional assumptions limited how far intelligence could reshape decision-making. Quiet fronts expanded, but they did so within structures that did not fully recognize their strategic significance. This tension became most visible when intelligence began to influence not just tactics, but strategy. As interception and analysis improved, it became possible to anticipate enemy actions weeks or months in advance. Shipping routes could be adjusted before submarines arrived. Air defenses could be repositioned before raids were launched. Deception plans could channel enemy forces toward empty objectives. These were not marginal effects. They reshaped the distribution of combat power across entire theaters. Yet the system struggled to absorb this reality. Strategic planners hesitated to base major decisions on information whose source could not be revealed. Commanders feared acting on intelligence that might be wrong, because failure would be visible while success would remain unexplained. Political leaders worried about dependence on capabilities that seemed fragile or secretive. As a result, intelligence-driven advantages were often used conservatively. They reduced risk rather than redefining strategy. Quiet frontlines influenced outcomes indirectly, shaping probabilities rather than dictating actions. This restraint delayed confrontation with the system's core contradiction. Intelligence had become decisive, but institutions still treated it as supplementary. The system continued to prioritize loud battles because they were legible, controllable, and politically defensible. Reality, however, was about to force resolution. As the war progressed into its middle years, the cumulative effects of quiet frontlines began to surface. Small informational advantages produced disproportionate results. Enemy mistakes multiplied without clear cause. Patterns emerged that could not be explained by material superiority alone. The system was now approaching a point where its hidden vulnerabilities would be exposed by real-world conditions. Information delays, analytical bias, and institutional fragmentation would collide with adaptive adversaries. The quiet frontlines would no longer merely shape outcomes at the margins. They would determine them. The failure did not occur at a single moment, nor did it announce itself as a collapse. It emerged through accumulation, small informational distortions compounding across time, organizations, and theaters, until outcomes became structurally irreversible. The quiet frontlines did not explode into crisis. They quietly overwhelmed systems that had been built to ignore them. By late 1942, intelligence volume had surpassed institutional capacity in every major belligerent power. Signals interception alone produced tens of thousands of messages daily. Direction-finding stations generated positional estimates with varying confidence levels. Aerial reconnaissance added photographic evidence that required expert interpretation. Human intelligence reports arrived sporadically, shaped by fear, ideology, and limited perspective. Each data stream carried uncertainty, and each demanded integration. The system was not designed for this scale. Analytical bottlenecks emerged immediately. Reports were filtered to fit established templates. Ambiguities were resolved prematurely to meet decision deadlines. Information that contradicted prevailing assessments was delayed, diluted, or excluded altogether. This was not sabotage. It was procedural inevitability. The system rewarded coherence, not doubt. As a result, intelligence increasingly reinforced existing assumptions rather than challenging them. In the Atlantic, German Naval Command believed that convoy losses reflected insufficient Allied escort numbers rather than intelligence penetration. When losses declined sharply in mid-1943, explanations focused on improved Allied shipbuilding and air coverage. The possibility that German communications were compromised was considered but discounted, because cipher security was treated as a technical certainty rather than an operational variable. This misinterpretation proved decisive. German submarines continued to operate under predictable communication patterns. Operational orders were transmitted frequently. Tactical doctrines assumed surprise where none existed. The informational asymmetry widened with each patrol cycle. Because the effects were distributed, one submarine lost here, another forced to disengage there. The failure was not perceived as systemic. There was no single battle to analyze, no decisive engagement to explain. Losses accumulated gradually until replacement rates collapsed and operational tempo fell below sustainability. On land, similar dynamics unfolded. In occupied Europe, resistance networks transmitted information about troop movements, rail schedules, and industrial output. These reports fed into Allied intelligence assessments that shaped bombing priorities and invasion planning. Yet within Axis command structures, the impact of these networks was underestimated. Security services focused on visible acts of sabotage rather than on information leakage. Counterintelligence metrics measured arrests, not compromised decisions. As a result, German deployments increasingly reflected Allied expectations rather than German intentions. Reinforcements were positioned to counter feints. Strategic reserves were withheld from actual points of attack. When major operations unfolded, Axis forces reacted to realities that had been shaped months earlier by adversary intelligence dominance. The failure here was not one of bravery or discipline. It was epistemic. Commanders made rational decisions based on incomplete or distorted information. They trusted systems that had worked before. They discounted warnings that could not be conclusively proven. In the air war, the pattern repeated. Strategic bombing campaigns relied on deception operations that masked true targets and timings. False radio traffic, dummy formations, and controlled leaks shaped enemy air defense deployments. Radar coverage was manipulated. Fighter units were drawn away from critical zones. These outcomes depended on intelligence-driven anticipation, not battlefield improvisation. Yet defending forces interpreted failures as local miscalculations rather than systemic manipulation. Adjustments were made incrementally. New radar stations were built. Patrol patterns were altered. But the underlying assumption that enemy intelligence could not see deeply into planning processes remained intact. This assumption was wrong. By 1944, Allied intelligence had achieved a degree of integration unprecedented in military history. Signals intelligence, human reporting, aerial reconnaissance, and operational deception were coordinated across theaters. Information moved horizontally between agencies and vertically into command planning. Analysts were embedded with operational staffs. Feedback loops shortened. Axis intelligence systems, by contrast, remained fragmented. Rivalries between military branches inhibited synthesis. Political interference distorted analysis. Warnings that challenged leadership expectations were suppressed or ignored. Code security concerns were subordinated to operational convenience. The contrast in system performance became stark. The failure reached irreversibility not when one side made a final mistake, but when adaptation lagged beyond recovery. Once information asymmetry crossed a critical threshold, corrective action required more time and coordination than the system could generate under pressure. For example, even when German naval authorities began suspecting code compromise, implementing new encryption systems required retraining operators, distributing materials, and altering procedures across dispersed units. Each step introduced temporary vulnerability. Under operational stress, postponement seemed rational. Postponement, however, guaranteed continued exploitation. Similarly, counterintelligence reforms in occupied territories required political trust, administrative capacity, and local legitimacy, none of which could be rapidly created amid escalating military pressure. By the time measures were enacted, the informational damage had already shaped strategic conditions. At this stage, outcomes were no longer contingent. They were path-dependent. Enemy forces exploited information advantages to reduce risk, concentrate force, and control tempo. Operations were launched when probabilities favored success. Engagements were avoided when conditions were unfavorable. Losses were imposed asymmetrically. The louder battles that followed reflected decisions already constrained by unseen dynamics. It is at this point that traditional explanations fail. Material superiority alone does not account for the speed and scale of collapse in certain theaters. Tactical errors do not explain repeated misallocation of reserves. Leadership failures, while real, do not fully account for consistent anticipation by the adversary. What explains these patterns is systemic failure at the informational level. The quiet frontlines did not merely support combat operations. They structured the environment in which decisions were made. They determined what commanders believed to be true, what risks they perceived as acceptable, and which options appeared viable. Once these perceptions diverged sufficiently from reality, no amount of courage or improvisation could compensate. This is the point at which the loudest battles became artifacts rather than drivers. They were expressions of deeper informational victories already achieved. Amphibious landings succeeded not because of surprise at the shoreline, but because surprise had been manufactured months earlier through deception and intelligence control. Air superiority was established not solely through aircraft numbers, but through foreknowledge of enemy responses. If you find this kind of forgotten military history as compelling as we do, we'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing. These stories matter because they explain not just what happened, but why. By the time adversaries recognized the extent of their informational disadvantage, correction was structurally impossible. The systems required to restore parity could not be rebuilt under fire. The quiet frontlines had already decided the shape of the war's endgame. The failure, therefore, was not sudden. It was systemic, cumulative, and invisible until it was irreversible. The consequences of this systemic failure did not arrive as a single, dramatic reversal. They unfolded as a reordering of strategic reality that commanders only gradually perceived and never fully reversed. What made the outcome decisive was not that one side possessed better weapons or larger forces, but that it operated inside an environment shaped by informational control that the other side could not see, let alone contest. By 1944, the effects of the quiet frontlines had become embedded in operational outcomes across every major theater. In Western Europe, Allied commanders enjoyed an unusual degree of confidence in timing and sequencing. Major operations were launched with a precise understanding of enemy dispositions, reinforcement timelines, and likely responses. This did not eliminate risk, but it reduced uncertainty to a manageable range. Decisions were made with awareness of enemy constraints that the enemy itself did not fully understand. What commanders did not yet publicly acknowledge was that this confidence did not come from battlefield reconnaissance alone. It came from sustained access to adversary communications, from long-term penetration of decision-making cycles, and from deception systems that shaped enemy expectations months in advance. The battlefield reflected these conditions because it had been prepared by them. Axis responses, by contrast, increasingly exhibited a pattern of reaction rather than initiative. Reserves were committed too late or to the wrong sectors. Counterattacks were launched against feints rather than main efforts. Defensive preparations anticipated threats that never materialized. Each individual decision could be justified on the information available at the time. Collectively, they revealed a command system operating within a distorted informational frame. The same dynamic played out in the air and at sea. Air defense systems were technically sophisticated, yet consistently misaligned with actual attack vectors. Naval deployments sought enemy concentrations that had already shifted. Operational pauses occurred where momentum should have been exploited. These were not failures of will or competence. They were failures of perception. The full impact would only become clear later, when post-war analysis revealed the depth of informational penetration and the extent to which operational choices had been anticipated and shaped. At the time, commanders on the losing side attributed defeat to overwhelming material superiority, internal dissent, or chance. These explanations were not false, but they were incomplete. The decisive factor was that one side could choose when and where to fight, while the other increasingly could not. This asymmetry also shaped strategic endurance. Because intelligence dominance reduced risk, it preserved resources. Losses were avoided where possible. Effort was concentrated where payoff was highest. Over time, this compounded into an advantage that no emergency mobilization could overcome. Attempts to adapt came too late. Organizational reforms introduced in 1944 and 1945 addressed symptoms rather than causes. New security procedures were implemented, but without time to rebuild trust in their effectiveness. Intelligence agencies were reorganized, but under conditions that prevented deep integration. Political interference continued to distort analysis, even as evidence mounted. Correction was impossible because the system had already crossed a threshold of dependency. Commanders relied on existing processes because alternatives could not be validated quickly enough. In wartime, uncertainty itself is a risk, and abandoning familiar systems introduces uncertainty even when those systems are flawed. As a result, the quiet frontlines remained dominant through the end of the conflict. They did not replace conventional battle, they rendered it predictable. This outcome carries a lesson that extends beyond the Second World War. What failed was not intelligence as a function, but the institutional understanding of intelligence as a decisive domain. Military organizations optimized for visible combat because it aligned with their structures, incentives, and traditions. When information itself became a primary determinant of outcomes, these organizations adapted incrementally rather than fundamentally. The lesson is not that secrecy guarantees victory, nor that intelligence superiority alone decides wars. It is that systems built for one form of conflict may become liabilities when the character of conflict changes. When decision-making depends on assumptions that no longer reflect reality, even well-executed actions can accelerate defeat. Modern institutions face a similar challenge. Information now moves faster, in greater volume, and across more domains than ever before. The temptation remains to privilege what is visible, measurable, and immediately actionable. Quiet frontlines, whether digital, economic, or informational, still struggle for recognition because their effects are indirect and their victories invisible. The Second World War demonstrates that such frontlines matter most when they are least acknowledged. By the time their influence becomes obvious, outcomes are often already fixed. The loudest battles of that war are remembered because they were dramatic and costly. The silent frontlines are forgotten because they were administrative, analytical, and unseen. Yet it was in those quiet spaces, where information was gathered, interpreted, and quietly exploited, that the war's decisive advantages were built. Understanding this does not diminish the sacrifices made on visible frontlines. It explains why those sacrifices unfolded within constraints shaped far from the sound of guns. That is how silent frontlines fought the loudest battles.